Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. The RPF. In November 1973, Hubbard came up with an idea to handle troublemakers, backsliders, or anyone else aboard who happened to displease him. He created the Rehabilitation Project Force, the RPF, the Sea Org's version of a prison camp. RPFers were to do hard physical labor all day, and in the evenings were to audit one another, to get off their overts and withholds, and deal with their evil intentions. RPFers were not allowed to speak to a crew member in good standing, unless spoken to, and had to wear black boiler suits. They were allowed to eat only after everyone else in the ship had finished, and were not allowed to leave the ship. Hubbard considered RPFers to be psychotic criminals that should be grateful that he was giving them a chance to be rehabilitated. Isn't it strange that some of Scientology's top leaders today, including Pat Broker and Norman Starkey, have been on the RPF? Most Scientology executives have at one time or another been on the RPF. It's interesting. Once Hubbard had conceived of the RPF, he had his assistants go through PC folders of everyone on board, looking for a particular E-meter read, called a rock slam. Rock slams, according to Hubbard, indicated that the person had committed high crimes against Scientology and was therefore psychotic. Anyone with a rock slam recorded in his folder was a candidate for the RPF. We were also given a personality test called the OCA. Anyone with a low score could also be sent to the RPF. In addition to these people, anyone who was considered to have intentions contrary to that of the group could be sent to the RPF. I can remember one woman on Hubbard's personal household staff was sent to the RPF because he thought she was trying to poison him. Actually, she worshipped the man and would have sooner poisoned herself than him. People from the household unit were RPF'd with great regularity. The closer a person was to LRH, the more likely they were to eventually be sent to the RPF. Yeah, Hubbard never went, did he? Asinine. The whole process of deciding who was going to the RPF took only about 2 months. During that time, everyone aboard was quaking in their boots. The air was thick with tension. Everyone was terrified at the prospect of going to the RPF. I was particularly worried because I had gotten into trouble so often. I knew my name would be on the list, and I dreaded it. But I kept hoping that by some miracle, I would not be on the list. On January 10th, 1974, the list of people being sent to the RPF was finally released, and sure enough, I was on it, along with about 15 other people. Imagine they wanted to volunteer for this, and this is the thank you that they get. We were awakened early that morning and shown the ethics order. I had been expecting it, but I was still in a state of shock that it had actually happened to me, as were other people on the list. I can remember one woman who had been on the list immediately started packing her suitcase, saying she wasn't going to stay and stand for this. But she ended up staying. Another one of the people on the original list of the RPFers was Norman Starkey, who currently holds a very high position in Scientology. The number of people in the RPF increased rapidly. It seemed that every day someone new was being busted, as we like to call it. There were several other auditors and interns on the RPF. They volunteer for this, you guys. Except the kids don't. It is difficult to describe the pain I felt that day. One moment I would feel numb with shock, and the next I would burst into uncontrollable tears. It's called being deceived. The others in the RPF were going through the same thing, and within a few days we developed a common bond of empathy for one another. We had our own private RPF jokes and songs. This unity we felt saved what little was left of our dignity, and there was a strong agreement among us that we would stick together and pull each other through. What happened among us is a great tribute to the strength of the human spirit, although most of us wrongly attributed this positive unity to Hubbard and thanked him for inventing the RPF. Now I realize that that was about as ridiculous as it would be for a Jewish person who survived the Holocaust to thank Hitler for inventing concentration camps. We got through this experience on the RPF in spite of Hubbard, not because of Hubbard. In a way, once we got over the initial shock, being on the RPF was a relief to most of us, because there were no more threats about being sent to the RPF. We were already there. We had hit bottom. When we were first assigned to the RPF, we were told we could contest it by requesting a committee of evidence. Somehow that really seems familiar to me, in which certain individuals are told they need to sign non-disclosure agreements. There's a similarity there. It's a way of trying to control someone and handling them. Committee of Evidence, Scientology's version of a trial. I had requested such a committee, and my close friend Quentin Hubbard was assigned as chairman of my committee. Oh, to turn them two against each other. You see? That was to turn them against each other. Someone saw that they were bonding, probably L. Ron Hubbard. He didn't like it, so now he wants to turn them against each other. Awful, awful, awful organization. Quentin Hubbard was assigned as chairman of my committee, and also the committee of Lisa Zanda, another friend of his. Yeah, see what I told you? LRH couldn't let Quentin have anything, could he? He had no choice but to find me guilty and uphold the decision that I remain on the RPF. No other verdict would have been considered acceptable. A few days later, Quentin was missing from the ship, and a search party was sent out to find him. While the search party was out, Quentin came back aboard the ship and confessed to a messenger that he had taken a whole bottle of pills. It's so sad. The messenger told his father, and after his stomach was pumped, he was put into isolation in his cabin for about a month. Isn't that wonderful, you guys? No love at all. He was not allowed to communicate with anyone except his auditor. After that, he was assigned to the RPF. Great father. Imagine that people, moronic imbeciles, think L. Ron Hubbard is some kind of a god. Look at right there at what he did to his own son. And everyone else went along with it. So they're just as bad. The people that were going along with it, just as bad. When I saw Quentin, I forgot all about my troubles. He looked so thin and vulnerable. I vowed that I would protect him and get him through the RPF. In the RPF, people were paired off to audit one another, and somehow I managed to be paired off with Quentin. Quentin and I also became the RPF case supervisors. Although RPFers were not normally allowed to be on the deck that Quentin's cabin was on, he and I were given special permission to go to his cabin, study folders, and audit one another. That cabin became a haven for both of us. Even though Quentin was very run down, he was very brave. He never lost his sense of humor. We spent a lot of time together in his cabin, talking, laughing, and eating peanut butter that he had taken from his family food supply. Later, Quentin referred to these days as the peanut butter days of the RPF. Quentin and I hung in there for one another and developed an even closer bond of friendship. Humor, warmth, and love were rare commodities aboard the ship, but ones which Quentin and I shared in abundance. I have read many accounts that describe Quentin as a miserable person. While I don't deny this, I saw another side of Quentin. He was a person who somehow was able to continue love in spite of all the personal misery he was going through. Yeah, the abuse from his father. I'll never forget Quentin and the bond we shared. He never abandoned me, even after I left Scientology. The last letter I received from him was just 2 weeks before the day he went into a coma. I didn't know he went into a coma. I'm going to have to research that. My LRH commendation. When I graduated from the RPF in May of 1974, I was sent back to complete the internship, and Quentin returned to his position as a flag auditor. I quickly completed the internship requirements and became a full-fledged flag class 4 auditor, which was a dream come true for me. The summer of 1974 was to be the high point of my time in Scientology. I was assigned a very difficult case to audit. The person was a Scientology executive from South Africa who had previously been director of processing, the person in charge of the auditors. On flag, during the same time I was an intern and getting into so much trouble. We didn't get along at all, and here I was, assigned to audit him. While in South Africa, he had gotten into ethics trouble and had just graduated from the RPF. Maybe assigning me to audit him was a way to further punish him, or maybe it was just a coincidence. I don't know what the powers that be were thinking when they assigned his case to me, but we turned the tables on them and surprised everyone, including LRH. I knew that the first thing I had to do was to get him to trust me so we could develop a rapport, which was essential if the auditing was to be at all successful. Somehow we managed to work things out between us, and his auditing went very well. By the time we had finished, he was glowing. The difference in his before and after personality tests was dramatic and caught the attention of Hubbard. He sent down a memo commending me on my auditing, delivered to me by one of his messengers, Anne, currently Anne Broker. He said that I was to be held up as an example of what flag auditing is all about. There's no loyalty in Scientology, is there? The games of the narcissists. This commendation had tremendous significance to me, as well as to others. People who never gave me the time of day were all of a sudden very nice to me. That's conditional. After all, Hubbard had said the auditors are the most valuable things on the planet, or beings on the planet. And flag auditors are considered to be the cream of the crop. To be held up as an example of an ideal flag auditor was to be at the top of the most elite group of people on the planet. In my eyes at the time, we were the people who would save the planet. I felt tremendous power. Quentin and I continue to be good friends, spending a great deal of time together. We still spent a lot of time in his cabin, laughing together and playing with his tape recorder. We were always making up funny little skits and commercials and taping them. Once we just taped ourselves laughing for several minutes, and when we listened to the tape, we laughed even harder. On our days off, we would often go ashore together. Quentin loved to watch airplanes, including landing and taking off at local airports. His real dream was to become a pilot, but his father had other plans for him. Sound like Diddy? Diddy won't promote his own children that want to be in the entertainment business? Quentin and I became very close to getting involved sexually, but we didn't because he told me that several years earlier he had become sexually involved with a young woman, and she had been sent off the ship when his father found out. His father doesn't want anything for him, you see that? That's who Scientologists worship. He didn't want to get me into that kind of trouble, so we remained good friends. He once told me that he had decided not to get married until he was 25 years old, an age he never reached. Regarding the rumor that he was a homosexual, he told me that when he used to tell that to some of the women on the ship who were after him because of who he was, just to get rid of them. If he did engage in homosexual relationships later, it was probably because he was never allowed to have a heterosexual relationship with anyone. I don't know about that. That's that Scientology mind control. The mission to New York. In August 1974, I was sent to New York City on a 6-week mission ordered by Hubbard. This was considered to be a great honor. My mission was to audit Molly Bornstein, the commanding officer on the Flag Liaison Office in New York, and her husband, Al, also an executive there. Unlike some Sea Org missions, our mission was a friendly one. Molly and Al weren't in any kind of trouble and were very happy that an auditor was being sent from Flag, especially to audit them. 2 other people accompanied me on the mission. Joan Robertson, a top Scientology executive who was in charge of the mission, and David Engelhardt, a staff member on Flag. I'm not sure what their purpose was, but it had something to do with helping the organization run more smoothly. We flew across the Atlantic from Lisbon to New York City. I had been away from the United States for over a year and was very happy to be returning for a visit. We stayed at the Hotel Alden on 81st Street in Central Park West, headquarters of the org. My accommodations felt very luxurious to me. I had my own large private room and bath, and we were given an allowance to eat all of our meals out in restaurants. The first night we ate at a dinner in the neighborhood. I ordered a cheeseburger, fries, and a hot fudge sundae. I had missed American food and felt like I had died and gone to heaven. I had lost a lot of weight due to the hard physical labor when I was on the RPF, and all the times I couldn't eat anything because I was seasick. I was very thin and could eat anything I wanted without fear of gaining too much weight. I remember sitting up on the roof, enjoying the view and eating a whole pint of Haagen-Dazs ice cream. I hadn't realized until then how homesick I had been for the United States. I savored the simplest pleasures that most people take for granted, like being able to take a bath and use as much water as I wanted. On the ship, we had to take 30-second showers due to the shortage of water. Since we were from Flag, we were treated like royalty by the people in the org. After all, we were Hubbard's personal representatives. As Flag missionaries, Molly and Al turned out to be genuinely nice people. They showed us around New York City, and we all had a great time together. Molly and Al's auditing went well, and the mission was considered a success. When I was in New York, my parents came to visit me. I had called them when I arrived in New York. It was the first time in over a year that I was able to tell them where I was, since the location of Flag had to be kept a secret. When I told them where I was, they immediately flew to New York to visit me. My mother remarked that I looked very thin, but she seemed to be very happy to see me. I had also stopped wearing my glasses because I had convinced myself my eyesight had improved. I knew that my parents were concerned, but they didn't criticize my involvement in any way, since they had learned that such tactics didn't work with me. No intervention, short of deprogramming, would have worked on me at the time because of the high I was on. I had been through a lot of pain, but at that point I felt it all had been worth it. At the time, I thought that my bad days were all behind me, and from here on, I would soar to greater and greater heights. See the games they play with people's heads? As far as I was concerned, I was doing work that was vital to the salvation of the planet. It was almost as if the pain and suffering I had been through enhanced the high I was on that summer. I felt I had earned it. So right now she's mind controlling herself. You see what I mean? That's what they do. You got the highs, then the lows, the highs, then the lows. The rock concert. In early September 1974, I returned to the ship. When I arrived, I found out that Quentin was away on his annual 3-week vacation. I started on my next level of training, the Class 7 course, an internship, which qualifies the auditor to audit a set of processes called Power and Power Plus, designed to give the PC the ability to handle power. At that time, power was an important grade of Scientology, but today these processes are rarely, if ever, used. Shortly after my arrival, an event occurred on the ship, which changed things for us dramatically. We were on the island of Madeira, which is owned by Portugal. There had been political trouble in that area, and a political coup had recently taken place in Lisbon. It seemed that a group of communists in Madeira thought that the people aboard the ship were CIA, and one afternoon they threw rocks at the ship, injuring several people. I missed this fiasco because I happened to be ashore at the time, along with several other people from the ship, including Mary Sue. My friend Karen and I had just been to a movie and were on our way back to the ship when we were met by some people who told us what had happened. We were taken to a local disco to hide out until it was safe to return to the ship. Later that night, we were taken to the ship, which had gone out to anchor. This event thereafter became known as the Rock Concert. Hubbard decided that we would sail across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States, a voyage we began the next day. The trip across the ocean was smooth, and for once, I didn't get seasick. The ocean was as smooth as glass. I loved to stand above the decks and just look at the vast expanse of ocean on all sides of me. We were just off the shore of South Carolina when Hubbard was warned that IRS agents were waiting on the docks to arrest Hubbard. So we headed for Bermuda, where we stayed for several weeks. You imagine this? We're supposed to believe that he evaded authorities for what, 40 years, 50 years? Come on. This wonderful, peaceful voyage across the Atlantic, unbeknownst to me, was to be the calm before the storm. All hell was about to break loose. Here we go again, another roller coaster ride. While we were in Bermuda, Quentin returned from his vacation and dropped a bombshell. It seemed that his father tried to hush it up, but Quentin told me the whole story in a very calm, detached way. According to what Quentin told me, he had decided to kill himself again and had constructed an elaborate plan for his suicide. He flew to New York and took a room at the Times Square Hotel. He then took his passport, which was his only form of ID, and hid it behind the bathroom mirror in his hotel room. He didn't want anyone to know that he was the son of L. Ron Hubbard when his body was found. He then flew to San Francisco, where he planned to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. But when it came time for him to jump, he just couldn't do it. After that, he was found wandering around on a road when he was stopped by police who were looking for someone who had committed a crime. They determined that Quentin didn't fit the description of the suspect, but since he seemed confused and disoriented, they took him to a mental hospital. In order to protect his family's name, Quentin pretended to have amnesia. He was in an institution for about 2 weeks when someone from Scientology tracked him down, at which point Quentin regained his memory of who he was and was released. He told me the story in a very matter-of-fact tone of voice, as if he were telling me about an innocuous vacation itinerary. I was horrified, and he noticed. He remarked that the expression on my face looked like the expression on his mother's face when he told her about it. Quentin and his mother were very close. In spite of all her other faults, Mary Sue really did love her children, and Quentin seemed to be her favorite. I don't think you should ever have favorites when you have children. My opinion. To this day, I don't know if it was L. Ron Hubbard or Mary Sue, but someone was very upset that Quentin told me what happened. David Mayo, the senior case supervisor, ordered me not to see Quentin anymore without telling me who the order came from or why. I don't think the order originated with David, probably from LRH. I asked him what was really going on, and he flatly refused to discuss the matter further. Just dumb people, man. David and I had gotten along very well in the past, but he was very firm on this issue. So was I. I said that Quentin was my friend. He needed me and I was going to be there for him. I told him that my personal life was none of his business. We got into a big argument. David's wife, Meryl, a top auditor on Flag, tried to get me to shut up to protect me. But I wouldn't back down. She knew I would get into trouble if I made waves. And she was right. David warned me that if I continued to see Quentin, I would be sent to the RPF. See, that's their control. I continued to argue with him, and he put me on a retread, which meant I had to go back and review certain materials as an auditor. He also had an ethics officer talk to me. Ethics officer, warning me of the consequences of having anything further to do with Quentin. It's really sad. I was supposed to just follow orders like a good little robot, but at that point, I still wasn't completely brainwashed, so I refused. I defied the order and kept right on seeing Quentin. There was still nothing sexual going on between us, but other people thought that there was, and that we were hiding it. I mean, it's just sickening. They don't allow anybody, there's no boundaries. Like there's no privacy. Sick, really sick. One time I had made a joke to Quentin, taking a shower with him, and somehow this came up in one of his auditing sessions and was written down, so I suppose David assumed that something was going on. I was being incensed that my personal life was being interfered with and wasn't going to stand for it. Imagine that the United States government knows that this is going on. Meanwhile, I had finished my retread of course materials and was back auditing on my Class 7 internship. I was auditing another intern, Rick, on power processes. His auditing went very well and he completed the grade before all the processes had been run. In power at the time, if the PC went exterior, meaning if he had an out-of-body experience, he was considered complete on the grade and no more power processes, or its companion, Power Plus, were to be run. This was the case with Rick, and he happily attested to completion of the grade. 1 week later, Rick came down with a cold, and I, as his auditor, was immediately blamed and accused of out-tech. Hubbard personally ordered to see the folder, which was something he didn't often do. The folder was inspected by one of his teenage messengers, Jill Goodman, who was not a trained auditor and didn't know the first thing about what to look for. She told Hubbard that I hadn't taken the correct action to repair his Power Plus, which was a bald-faced lie. The fact is I hadn't even run Power Plus, and so any action taken to correct that level would have been meaningless. Any auditor trained as a Class 7 could have seen that, but nobody seemed to want to get involved. The result was an ethics order from Hubbard, personally canceling all of my certificates. Oh, isn't that great, you guys? And ordering a committee of evidence to be convened on me. I desperately tried to write to Hubbard to explain that this PC had never received Power Plus, and to please look at the folder himself. I never received an answer. It's because he's a narcissist. He just needed a reason. At the time, I blamed Jill Goodman for this travesty of justice, but spiteful as she was, I now see that she was just another victim of Hubbard's. Today, she's out of Scientology and realizes what happened to her. In an interview with Russell Miller for his book, Barefaced Messiah, she said, "We became poisonous little wrenches. We had power and we were untouchable." I certainly have to agree with her statement, but I don't blame her anymore. The truth that I was unwilling to face at the time was that neither David Mayo nor Jill Goodman were to be blamed for what happened. I am sure that LRH was to blame, and I think he was getting back at me for continuing to see Quentin. Probably jealous as well. Someday I would like to talk to David Mayo and Jill Goodman and find out exactly what went on. An order for a committee of evidence from LRH was considered a serious matter. Every charge in the book was thrown at me and Barbara, the woman who was appointed chairman of my committee of evidence. Was well known on the ship to be someone who despised me. Before she got married, Barbara's husband had been interested in me. I didn't return his feelings, so he eventually got involved with Barbara and married her. I was happy to see that he found someone, but Barbara never got over her insecurity about me, because sometimes her husband would still flirt with me in a joking way. He would bump into me on purpose and say things like, "We've got to stop meeting like this." Nothing ever came of it because I wasn't interested in him. Barbara made it very clear that she couldn't stand me. This is a matter of written record because once I was supposed to audit her, and she refused to have me as her auditor. This is the person who was appointed as chairman of my committee of evidence. Of course it was. Of course it was. I'm sure she had a great time finding me guilty of all charges. Once again, I was sent to the RPF. In addition, all my auditing certificates had been canceled by LRH. All that time and work and money she put in, and just like that, it's canceled. After I heard the committee's verdict, I went to Quentin's cabin and told him about it. I knew that once I was on the RPF, I would no longer be allowed to go there. Told him that the RPF would be a relief after what I had been through in the past few months. I had lost everything I had worked so hard for. Yeah, narcissists, they just snap their fingers, and that's the kind of things that happen. I didn't see how things could get much worse for me. I was wrong. Things got much worse. The lesson of the RPF. In January 1975, I was once again on the RPF. This time, however, it was not like the RPF of 1974 that I had been through the first time. This group of RPFers did not pull together to help each other through, and it was not so easy for me to get out. A new feature of the RPF had been invented called the RPF's RPF for people who got into trouble on the RPF. A person assigned to the RPF's RPF had to work deep down in the engine room of the ship all day cleaning all billages and was supposed to sleep in the chain locker. There's that chain locker again. No communication with anyone was allowed. What is that called in prison? What is it called when they throw you in prison, like an isolation? I forget. No communication with anyone was allowed, except for the RPF's ethics officer. The first person assigned to the RPF's RPF was an executive from London named Ron Hopkins. I caught occasional glimpses of him on his way to and from the engine room. He was covered with muck from the billages and looked miserable. He still had a chest cough from a bout of pneumonia he was obviously still recovering from. After a few weeks, Ron got out of the RPF's RPF and joined us on the RPF. He and I became friendly, and at first he was one person who was supportive of me. I saw him as a very sensitive yet strong person. I can remember that he loved to play flamenco guitar and would often play for us. He was a natural leader and soon became the person in charge of the RPF, at which time his cult personality took over. I would guess to say that's probably a narcissistic trait right there. I mean, maybe it is a cult personality. Sounds like narcissism to me. Life on the RPF was hard. Beginning each day at 5:30 a.m., we were divided into groups of 5 to 7 people. The women's teams cleaned all the heads' bathrooms. On the ship, certain passageways and lounges, such as the aft lounge. Cleaning the heads didn't mean just swishing some toilet bowl cleaner around and going on to the next one. We had to scrub down the entire bathroom, including all the bulkheads, walls, and ceilings. After we cleaned an area, it had to pass a white glove inspection. If the glove came up dirty, the person who cleaned that area had to run laps from bow to stern of the ship, about 1/5 of a mile each. One time when my senior wasn't satisfied with the way I cleaned a bathroom. Of course he wasn't. She ordered me to take a lap. I protested because I thought she was being unfair, and her reply was, "Don't Q&A with me. Take 2 laps." I objected again, and she said, "Take 4 laps." This went on until I was up to about 10 laps, which I eventually had to do. Another time I was ordered to run laps, and I walked them instead. The person in charge of the RPF at the time, Homer Schumer, caught me walking and ran after me. Tried to run away from him, but he was too fast for me. He caught me by physically grabbing me, and I ended up having to do more laps. The lessons we were to learn on the RPF was to obey orders without question. Kind of like the last 4 years, you guys, since 2020 to 2024. You know, you don't do something, you lose your job. You don't do something, you lose this. Regardless of how we felt about it or who was giving the orders, this was a lesson that I was obviously very unwilling to learn. I had not learned it my first time on the RPF, so I was back a second time. Blind obedience violated everything I had ever valued. I had thought that Scientology was about independence and self-determinism, not blind obedience to authority. To add to my difficulties, I was having trouble with my auditing partner. Being audited and auditing another through the RPF program was a requirement for graduation, and my partner and I just weren't compatible. Finally, it became clear that it wasn't working out between us, and at his request, he was assigned to someone else. I tried another auditing partner, but that didn't work out either. I felt desolated. There seemed to be no hope for me getting out of the RPF. I can remember one day when I was completely broke down. I went down into the lower hold where the RPF classroom was and cried like I have never cried before in my life. That's what they want. I have never cried before in my life. It felt like I was never going to stop. I felt totally out of control. Finally, Ron Hopkins went to the medical officer and got me some CalMag. Oh, Jesus. Which was supposed to calm me down so I could get some rest. It seemed to work for a few hours, but the next day, my grief came back. I went through several days where I couldn't stop crying. That's so sad. I was in a deep state of mourning. I had lost a great deal more than an auditing partner. On an emotional level, I had come to the realization that Scientology was a sham, but only on an emotional level. I had no words to describe my loss at the time. There was no exit counselor or deprogrammer around to help me see what was really happening. All I knew was that I felt worse than I ever had in my entire life. David Mayo noticed the state I was in and seemed very concerned, but not even the senior case supervisor could fix what was wrong with me. I felt I had lost everything. I had come into Scientology with great dreams and visions about what could be, and I had worked hard to make those dreams a reality. For a while, I felt that my dreams had come true. Less than a year before that, I had felt like I was on top of the world and that all the bad times were behind me. Then it was all taken away from me. Why was it taken away from me? Because I had asserted my right as a human being to choose my own friends, and the friend I happened to have chosen was L. Ron Hubbard's son. I wish to God he hadn't been Hubbard's son, but he was. Hubbard could wipe a person out, it seemed. He could build a person up, make every dream come true, and then suddenly take everything away. Just like that. I had lost my ability to be angry. All I could do was cry. That's very sad. At one point I said I wanted to leave, but David Mayo and Jeff Walker managed to talk me out of it. David said things like, "You're going to break my heart," and Jeff really got to me when he said, "You'll be forgotten about once you've left the Sea Org." I finally decided I had to try to stick it out and stay no matter what happened. As unhappy as I was, I believed that life outside of Scientology would be much worse. That's the programming. That's what they get everyone to think. They get themselves to think this. I made one final attempt to assert myself. One day I was standing watch as quartermaster logging people on and off the ship. This was a duty the RPFers were often assigned to do. One day I had been on watch all morning and someone was supposed to relieve me so I could have lunch, but no one showed up. Finally, I went below decks to the aft lounge to see what happened to my relief person. Ron Hopkins and some other RPFers were having lunch and he refused to help me. I just exploded. My anger had very little to do with what was actually going on. I just felt I had to make one last attempt to assert myself. I said I was going to have my lunch and to hell with everything, at which point Ron said, "That's it. You're assigned to the RPF's RPF." You see this? It's just like idiocracy. Just all people that want to control. And some of them are being so punished they don't even know what's going on anymore. I'll never forget these words. I knew I had gone too far and tried to apologize, but it was no use. Ron was adamant. He said I could request a comm ev if I wished to challenge the assignment. But if I did, I would probably be thrown out of the Sea Org in disgrace. You see, 1 minute she wants to leave. You see that? That's a power move. 1 minute she wanted to leave the Sea Org, and then this guy Ron was saying, don't break his heart and all this stuff. And then the next minute he's saying that she'll be thrown out in disgrace. It's all about control. All about control. Sickening. And so it came to pass that on May 26, 1975, I was assigned to the RPF's RPF. I spent very long days down in the engine room, cleaning foul-smelling muck out of the billages, and then painting them. Fortunately, Ron Hopkins showed me some mercy, and I didn't have to sleep in the chain locker. I was assigned a condition of enemy, and to get out of it, I had to write up the formula, which was find out who you really are. Yeah, find out that you're a nut job, psychopath, convict, balding, black tooth, pot belly, military flunky, loser who thinks it's okay to kiss 7-year-old girls on the mouth and that they shouldn't resist because they can remember all their sexual experiences from past lives. Loser cult, L. Ron Hubbard. To get out of it, I had to write up the formula, which was find out who you really are. I wrote up the formula and submitted it to Ron Hopkins, but he wouldn't accept what I had written. I didn't know what he wanted me to write. For days, I struggled to find an answer that would satisfy him. Who was I? At that point, I really didn't know. If I had known who I really was, I would have let them throw me out and gotten as far away from the ship and everyone aboard as I could. But leaving Scientology was a possibility that I was not willing to consider. Jeff and David had talked me out of it earlier, and at that time I felt that leaving Scientology would be worse than whatever hell I was going through on the ship. I spent 5 days on the RPF's RPF, but it seemed much longer. I wasn't allowed to communicate with anyone except Ron Hopkins. One day David Mayo broke the rules and spoke to me. I dutifully told him that he was not allowed to speak to me. He told me not to worry about it. I'll never forget what he did for me that day, just by breaking the rules and talking to me. I don't recall exactly what he said, but he encouraged me to hang in there and helped me feel I could make it through this horrendous experience. That's a decent thing to do. I've heard some good things about David Mayo. He showed me compassion when I needed it the most. I determined that I would hang on to what little sanity I had left. The way I did this was to shut off all my emotions. It was a matter of survival. That also reminds me of, it's kind of a way to disassociate, numbing. A lot of people do it and they don't even realize it. It's what trauma does. Finally wrote up my formula to Ron's satisfaction and got out of the RPF's RPF. I had been broken. After a long, hard struggle, when Ron Hopkins said, "That's it, you're assigned to the RPF's RPF," on May 26, 1975, in the aft lounge of the flagship Apollo, something snapped in me and I no longer had any urge to fight back. It's exactly what they want. I was no longer angry. I was no longer sad. I was no longer happy. I felt nothing. I simply did as I was told. At long last, I had learned the lesson of the RPF. I want to make it clear at this point that I don't blame Ron Hopkins, David Mayo, Jeff Walker, Kathy Karyataki, Jill Goodman, or any other Scientologist or Sea Org member for what I experienced on the ship. They were all under the influence of L. Ron Hubbard, and were only doing what they thought was best at the time. We were all trying to survive. I only hope that they are free now and understand what was really going on with all of us on the ship, so they can come to terms with it and go on with their lives. Up to this point, I have been at a loss for words in describing my experiences, but now I find myself feeling that I have very little to say about the period that followed my being released from the RPF's RPF. Perhaps this is because there was very little of me present during that time. My cult identity had taken over, and I had become a Rondroid, a robot for LRH. I had stopped causing trouble and did as I was told. During the summer of 1975, LRH started going ashore on photo shoots. Wouldn't that have been an opportunity for the authorities to nab him? Inquiring minds do want to know. He brought people in the RPF along with him and used us as crew and models. Can you imagine this? It's so sickening. And then the narcissist also needs people that are like doing way less, not as good as they are, to prop themselves up. With him and used us as crew and models. I was in several of the pictures, which are mainly photographic essays designed to promote Scientology. I never saw the final product and don't know if these pictures were ever published anywhere. I starred in one of them as a woman who was very sick, got auditing, and became the picture of health. In the before shot, these are propagandas shots, They made up my face with a pale grayish makeup to make me look awful. Then they showed me getting auditing, and in the after shot, put rosy-colored makeup and red lipstick on me, so I looked like I was glowing with good health. I can remember how Hubbard was very particular about how he wanted me to stand. He came over to me and showed me exactly how he wanted me to pose. Unlike the stories I heard about his later venture as a motion picture director, he seemed to be very nice on these photo shoots, which he enjoyed. It's because he's in his narc high. After all that had gone down between Hubbard and myself on the ship, this was the first time that he actually spoke to me in person without a messenger, other than the times he had nodded hello to me in passing. Imagine all the people are worshiping this loser. Those of us in the RPF began to spend more and more time on the photo shoots and less time on the RPF. Hubbard eventually formed an org called the LRH Photo Shoot Org, which consisted of many RPF members. For some reason other than occasionally modeling for some of his pictures, I was not on the staff of the Photo Shoot Org. The RPF gradually dwindled down until Ron Hopkins and I were the only ones left. Finally, the RPF disbanded entirely, and I was assigned to do folder error summaries, FESs, which means going through people's auditing folders and noting down auditing errors that were made in the progress of the case, or lack thereof. I was still not allowed to audit, but I was no longer on the RPF. In the fall, Hubbard sold the ship, and we all moved to a land base at the Fort Harrison Hotel in Clearwater, Florida. The accommodations there were a big improvement over the ship. I shared a hotel room with two of my best friends, Leek and Karen, both auditors. To anyone else, the room might have seemed crowded, but to us, we had more space than we had in years, as we were used to sleeping in a room with 50 other women on the ship. We even had a television set in our room. I hadn't watched TV in years. I would go up to my room during lunch breaks and after a day's work and watch TV. My favorite shows were Star Trek and Bewitched, both in reruns at the time. Many people in the Sea Org loved Star Trek, since we like to think of ourselves as being on a mission, like the crew of the USS Enterprise. In Florida, I continued fessing folders, which wasn't the most exciting job in the world, but it was peaceful. Some of the people whose folders I fessed were celebrities such as Karen Black, and Chick Corea. One day I went to see the intern supervisor at the time, Brian Livingstone, about getting my certificates back as an auditor. I assumed that he knew that LRH had ordered my certificates canceled, but he didn't remember. Just as he was going to write me out a program, Judy Theory came over to us and told him that LRH had canceled my certificates. Brian was furious with me and accused me of trying to trick him. I said that I thought he had known what had happened with me. It was just trying to find out how I could get my certificates back. But he refused to have anything further to do with me. Mind-controlled droids, man. In May, the commanding officer of AOLA, Gary Epstein, decided that he wanted me to return to Los Angeles and made a request to flag. I was ordered to return to Los Angeles and assigned the position of Director of Processing at the Advanced Org in Los Angeles, AOLA, where I had originally come from. Before I left, Jeff Walker finally gave me a program that I could follow to regain my certificates as an auditor. As Director of Processing, I would be responsible for the solo auditing of all the people who came to AOLA to do the clearing course, NOT levels. Even though it was a much better position than I currently had fessing folders, I was very sorry to leave Florida. I had requested to remain in Florida, but my request was denied, and I had no choice but to go to LA. In May 1976, I assumed the post of Director of Processing at AOLA. I felt very much alone and kept my distance from everyone. Some people seemed to be in awe of me because of the fact I had spent so much time on flag. No one knew about the trouble I had been in. I never got close to anyone at AOLA the whole time I was there. Like most Sea Org living quarters, the condition of the house I lived in was shabby, but I had my own small room. The house was in LA and we commuted by van to Hollywood. Every day where the org was located. As Director of Processing, I was receiving bonuses, in addition to my regular Sea Org pay, so I decided to take an apartment outside the staff house at my own expense. I shared a very nice 2-bedroom apartment across the street from where I worked, with 2 men who worked for the Guardian's office, but were not Sea Org members. I shared a room with one of the men, Jane, but our relationship was strictly platonic. We slept in separate beds. Living outside of Sea Org housing was unusual for a Sea Org member, but I managed to get away with it, probably because I had come to flag and no one dared to challenge me. Living in that apartment gave me more privacy than I'd had in years. I was becoming increasingly aware that I was not happy at all in the Sea Org. Gene was the only person I was at all close to, and he wasn't in the Sea Org, even though he was in Scientology. I missed my friends on Flag, Florida very much, especially Quentin. Quentin and I wrote to each other regularly. Imagine they're going through everyone's mail as well. During the time I was in LA, I increasingly spent more and more time alone. I would just go to my apartment every chance I got, just to get away from the org. Sometimes during my half-hour lunch break, I would go there and just think about my situation. I would sit there dreading having to go back to work and began to feel like I was really in a trap. She was right. There were things about my new job that I hated, such as having to make phone calls to people who had not paid for their next OT level. I was expected to use high-pressure tactics to get them to return. And this, I guess this is not considered sales, right? The governments of the world don't think this is sales. I remember telling one person that if he did not come in for his next OT level, that he would die. I really disliked making these phone calls, but it was an expected part of my job. I really didn't want to be an administrator, even though the position was considered senior to that of an auditor. I would have preferred just to be an auditor and work with people one-on-one, but in the Sea Org, what I wanted was never considered. I think that's all of Scientology. I began to think about leaving, and week by week, put a little bit of money aside from the bonuses I was receiving. At this point, I wasn't ready to take action on my thoughts, but put the money away just in case. One day in early July 1976, I received a frantic phone call from my mother. My father had been on vacation in Philadelphia and had had a heart attack. She said that it was very bad and the doctors didn't know if he'd make it through the night. Years later, she told me that she had tried to call the org 3 times before she finally got through to me. Nobody gave me her messages. The first 2 times, I immediately flew to Philadelphia. This is before there was as much control, I think. Spending the entire 5 hours in the air, not knowing if my father would be alive or dead when I arrived. To my Scientology identity, death didn't mean anything. One simply dropped one's body and could pick up a new one and start a new life. However, there was still a part of me that was aware of the personal tragedy that my father's death would be and the pain I would feel if I were to arrive at the hospital and find out he had died. When I finally did arrive in Philadelphia, early the next morning, I was very relieved to learn that my father had pulled through and was going to be all right. He did, however, have a very serious heart condition that would have to be constantly monitored. He was given a pacemaker while he was in the hospital that he would be dependent on. While I was in Philadelphia, I spent a great deal of time with my mother. I was in the WOG world, and with no other Scientologist anywhere around me. We stayed at a hotel near the hospital, and when we weren't visiting my father, we had a lot of time to talk. I can remember one conversation we had about life in the Soviet Union. My mother was telling me how people in the Soviet Union had no choice about their careers. From a very young age, the government decided what that person would do based not on personal desire, but on what was best for the Soviet Union. It must be a coincidence, huh? I thought about that for a while and realized that my life in Scientology was much the same as that of a Soviet. I wanted to live in Florida and be an auditor, and here I was in LA, doing a job I didn't want to do, and I had no choice in the matter. I confessed to my mother how I felt, and she asked me if I would consider coming home with her and not returning to the Sea Org. She said that the door would always be open to me. I wasn't ready to make such a move at the time, but it helped me tremendously to know I had an option. After being in the WOG world for 3 weeks, it didn't seem like such a terrible place. Imagine that they're still using the same tactics. When my father recovered enough to travel, we took him back to my parents' home in Michigan, where I stayed for about a week. I still felt I had to return to Scientology to try to work things out, and so on August 1st, 1976, I returned to LA after having been away for 3 weeks. Things in LA looked even worse. My senior, Tina, and I had never gotten along well. Soon after my return, we had a big fight, and I walked off my post as director of processing, refusing to work with her. I cannot recall what the fight was about, but I think it had something to do with her not giving me my mother's messages for several hours. The commanding officer, Gary Epstein, and the ethics officer tried to get me to go back on post, but I refused, saying that I would be willing to work at another job, but not with Tina. I volunteered to Fez folders and they agreed at least temporarily. I don't think anyone in LA quite knew what to do with me. If I had done such a thing on flag, I would have been immediately sent to the RPF. But in LA, people were in awe of me because I had been on flag, and besides, at the time, there was no RPF in LA. I felt like I was in limbo. I would come in every day and fez folders all day long. I wasn't being punished, so I was still allowed the same time off I always was. One day I had the afternoon off, and I was going for a walk by myself on Hollywood Boulevard. Suddenly, a significant mental shift occurred, and I thought to myself, what am I doing here? This is not what I had expected when I first joined the Sea Org. I really am unhappy here, and I can't go on like this. I've got to do something about my situation. Right then and there, I made the following decision. I would give the situation 2 weeks. If in 2 weeks things hadn't changed for the better, I would do one of two things. I would either go and talk to someone in the org, come clean and confess everything I had been thinking and feeling, and get straight with the group, or I would leave the group without telling anyone what I was going to do. The fact that I had allowed myself to have these thoughts was quite significant. It showed that because I had been away and spent so much time alone, I was beginning to free myself from the mind control I had been under for so many years. A person under mind control would never allow himself to have such critical thoughts about the group without censoring them. I had been taught that critical thoughts meant undisclosed crimes, but somehow I realized that my thoughts were valid and I was innocent. I returned to work the next day, keeping the decision I had made secret from everyone. This was something that I was going to have to work out on my own. The 2 weeks passed and nothing happened for a while. I continued to come in every day and fez folders. I said very little to anyone and no one seemed to bother me until Friday, August 20th, 1976. That afternoon, Gary Epstein had a talk with me. He was very angry with me for leaving my post and said I should cut out the nonsense and return to my post. He sarcastically accused me of thinking I was above everyone because I had been on flag with Quentin. See the jealousy? Unreal. He sent me to talk to the ethics officer, who was nicer. He tried to persuade me to return to my post, but I still refused. He said that if I didn't return, he would have no choice but to com-ev me. I knew that I would have to act soon. The next morning, Saturday, August 21st, I was fezzing folders as usual. Some of the people I worked with were gossiping about a young woman named Pandora Cooper, who had been an auditor and case supervisor for the org in Washington, D.C. It was rumored that she had wanted to leave and not be allowed to. She was locked up in a room against her will and forced to receive auditing. She pretended to go along with the auditing and told her captors that the auditing had really helped her and that she had changed her mind about leaving. Once she convinced them that she wanted to stay, they let her out of the room, at which time she left the org and never returned. I realized that what happened to Pandora could easily happen to me, and I had to act fast. I had saved up about $200 when I was director of processing and getting bonuses. When I left that position, I no longer got the bonuses that went along with it, only Sea Org pay, which was $10 a week at the time. Soon my $200 would be used up, and I would have no money to go anywhere and would have to give up my apartment. I concluded that if I wanted to leave the Sea Org, it would have to be that day before a committee of evidence was convened on me. It happened that I had the afternoon off that day, which gave me the perfect chance to leave, since I would not be missed until the following day, but I still hadn't made a final decision. I went for a swim, took a shower, and put on a new dress my mother had sent me. Then I went to a payphone and called the airlines to see if I could get a plane out of LA. But all the flights were booked up. Then I walked to the bus station to see when the next bus left to Michigan. There was a bus leaving at 6 p.m., and the fare was $125, which I could afford. The time was 2:30 p.m. I returned to my apartment and found one of my roommates there. I tried to act normal. He went out to get a paper, and I started to pack some of my things. Soon he returned, and I hastily hid what I had packed. I told him I had just been for a swim, and the water felt great, hoping he would go for a swim. Fortunately, he did, and I was left alone once again. Now there was nothing to stop me from leaving except the barriers I imposed on myself. For what seemed like a long time, but was probably no more than 5 minutes, I agonized over the final decision I knew I would have to make. I wanted to go, but was afraid. I knew that this would be my only chance to go. If I didn't do it that day, I might not get another opportunity for a long time, if ever. Yet I still vacillated between whether to go or whether to stay. I felt like I was making the biggest and toughest decision I ever had to make in my life. I finished packing some of my clothes in a small carry-on bag. I kept telling myself that I wasn't happy and that things were not going to get better, yet I still hesitated. Then suddenly I realized that making the decision to leave was never going to be easy, and if I waited for it to feel easy, I would never do it. Finally, I took the plunge. I gathered up a few of my things and left the apartment. I knew I couldn't take everything I had with me because I might run into someone I knew on the way to the bus station and would have difficulty explaining the suitcases. I just took a small carry-on bag, a plastic bag, and my handbag. I even made up a story to explain why I was carrying these bags if I ran into anyone on the street. But fortunately, I didn't have to use it. I was terrified of running into someone in the group and of being stopped and locked up against my will. As soon as I arrived at the bus station in Hollywood, which was about a 10-minute walk away from my apartment, I purchased my ticket to Michigan. Then I called my mother and told her I was coming home. She was overjoyed and strongly supported me in my decision to leave. She said, "I always knew you were a free spirit." At 5 p.m., my bus left Hollywood for L.A., where I was to change buses. I had a splitting headache and was still worried about someone finding me. It wasn't until my bus pulled out of L.A. at 6 p.m. that I finally began to relax. I felt more relieved than I ever have felt in my life. I felt as if a big weight had been lifted off me and that I was free at last. I am going to go ahead and start a new video, you guys, and the next video will be entitled, "I Begin My New Life." I'll leave a link in the description box. Like and subscribe if you choose. Otherwise, have an amazing day or night wherever you are. Peace.